President Putin's nuclear rhetoric is dangerous and irresponsible. We take these threats seriously, and we remain vigilant. We will not be intimidated. Any use of nuclear weapons would fundamentally change the nature of the conflict and have severe consequences. Russia knows that the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Allies were updated on NATO's long-planned deterrence exercise Steadfast Noon, which starts next week.
Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis is the Pentagon senior strategist, and he joins me now live from Woodbridge, Virginia. Thanks very much for joining us here on TRT World. Now, many would argue that since the very beginning of this conflict, President Putin has been very unpredictable. In fact, even before the conflict began, he was unpredictable to a point where I still remember once he said he has no plans to invade Ukraine, yet here we are today. So now with President Putin using what Stoltenberg says is a dangerous and irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, is there any way to predict what President Putin's next move would be, or predictions don't work with someone like Putin?
Yeah, it is difficult. Miscalculation is all over the map here. What's happened essentially is Mr. Putin is being pressured by the oligarchs and the elite in his own country, and it's even the common people, because of the mobilization that is, pulling in 300,000 of their young men. It really has the people in an uproar. And as a result, Mr. Putin has pulled into himself. He's not listening to his ministers. He's only listening to his inner circle. And then he is promulgating the policies and the plans to go forward. So it's hard to calculate what he might do. But what's clear is he's becoming more desperate. And, I think from the very beginning, Mr. Putin basically believes it's all or nothing in Ukraine, and he's not going to hold back. He's given an ultimatum, and I do believe that he means if he does not accomplish what he wants, that it is quite possible that he would use a nuclear weapon.
So the risk of a nuclear war is quite real.
Yeah, I see it as escalating. Now clearly, you mentioned Jens Stoltenberg out of NATO, and of course, he said a nuclear weapon would be a red line essentially, and very serious consequences. Now he did not say, nor did Joseph Borrell, who is the senior foreign policy advisor to the European Union. They both basically said there would be severe consequences for the Russians, but it is not necessarily a nuclear response. But then, of course, Stoltenberg once goes on and says, well, next week we're having a nuclear exercise, albeit an annual exercise that happens to coincide with this time period. So there are a lot of messages that are promulgating back and forth. And then, of course, Mr. Biden himself, just a week ago, made the statement about Armageddon, which, of course, is an end times war against good and evil. And he suggested that if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon, things would really go in a very bad way. So there's a lot of back and forth here. I don't believe, though, that if the West continues supplying Ukraine and Putin doesn't find some way to get out of this fight, then in all probability, it's quite possible NATO could be dragged into this war, in spite of what Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense here at the United States, said.
Mr. Maginnis, this is what I wonder at this point. If the threat of a nuclear catastrophe is real, then tell me, do you think NATO and the West are doing enough to contain this threat? Because when we look at it, since the very beginning of this conflict, NATO's stance has pretty much remained the same. It continues to stand in solidarity with Ukraine and make promises to provide weapons, advanced weapons, but nothing else besides that.
Yeah, at this point, of course, the statements about ramping up air defense weaponry to the Ukrainians, at this point, they've matched with HIMARS and 155 artillery what the Russians have been doing, and they're talking about giving the Ukrainians ATACMS, which are very long range ballistic missiles from HIMARS, and that would reach deep into Russia. And so you can see the possibility of a slippery slope here, that as the West through Ukraine continues to be successful against the Russians, then and the problems going on for Putin inside that country with his own people, this is a catastrophe in the making, and we have to be very careful going forward.
All right. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, thanks very much for talking to us here on TRT World. Really appreciate your taking out the time.